Nvidia reporting second quarter results. The chip maker reporting no sales of H20 chips to China-based customers in the second quarter, saying it benefited from millions of dollars in sales to H20 chips to a customer outside of China. And joining me now to talk about all this, we got Paul Triolo, DGA-Albright Stonebridge Group partner for China and technology policy lead. Paul, it's great to see you. I know, Paul, you're not a financial analyst, you're a policy guy, but I would love your take, Paul, on this earnings print. Stock is down about 3% here in the after hours. What stood out to you, Paul, about that report?
Yeah, great question. Look, I think there's this uncertainty about China is sort of gnawing at investors in terms of outlook here, because I think as we know, Nvidia didn't include any sales, of course, of H20s. I think that was expected given the quarter. But looking ahead, I think it's a little surprising that there's no revenue projected for H20s or this notional B30 based on the Blackwell architecture that's being designed explicitly for China. So it really highlights that Nvidia is really caught in the middle of this U.S.-China technology competition, if you will. And it's pretty amazing that U.S. policy can have such a huge impact on Nvidia's earnings here. We're talking about, I think the estimate was $4.8 billion or $5 billion worth of lost revenue from the H20. And then, there's Nvidia sitting on something like 700,000 H20s in the stockpile, hoping to sell those to China. And then they also paused potentially building more H20s at TSMC in Taiwan because of the uncertainty they're facing in China. Because the Chinese government, of course, is looking at the H20 and is also not happy about things like the US government talking about tracking GPUs. And so they've issued guidance to some of their companies to reconsider using the H20 and looking at domestic alternatives here. So Nvidia is really in a tough position here where the Chinese companies, I was in China last month, I talked to all the Chinese AI companies, they all want to buy the H20, for example, for inference, because it turns out to be really good for inference. But now they're up against the Chinese government desire for them to look at alternatives from companies like Huawei and others in China. So Nvidia has a much more complicated equation here as they look to the China market and look to figure out how they maintain a foothold there in this key space of AI, particularly AI inference, where the H20s and presumably these B30s would be highly useful to Chinese companies. So I'm just stunned in some degree by the huge impact that the U.S. restrictions have had on Nvidia's bottom line here.
Do you think, Paul, if I'm in this name, if I'm an investor, bottom line, I want to know what is my long-term opportunity over in China? How much money can CEO Jensen Huang ultimately make over there? Do you think we can really know that right now with any great degree of clarity and confidence, given all the headlines and dynamics and cross currents you're highlighting, Paul?
No, I think we really can't, because there's a couple of big things. One I didn't really mention either. So in addition to sort of where the Chinese government is going to come down on this, is it going to mandate, for example, that companies not use Western GPUs like from Nvidia and AMD? It's tricky because Chinese companies, as I said, want to use them. So there'll be some back and forth on this within China in terms of the H20s. Now, it's complicated also because the H20 is now viewed as somewhat outdated, and companies in China may be wanting to wait, for example, for the B30s that are based on the new Blackwell architecture. So there's sort of that technology component to this also. But over the long term, the hard thing to determine is when Chinese companies, in particular here Huawei, are going to be able to crank out, to produce at scale and volume some reasonable alternative to Nvidia's GPUs here, and that's hard to pin down. Right now, for example, SMIC, which is the domestic foundry, can produce a fairly small number, let's say 200,000 GPUs for Huawei, the Ascend series of GPUs. But Chinese developers don't really like this chip yet because there's still not a software environment around this. Of course, we know Nvidia has the CUDA architecture, and developers are used to using Nvidia hardware and software, and so but the government is working really hard to push domestic companies into the domestic alternative ecosystem, and that's Huawei. That's also a number of smaller GPU developers like Meta X and BREN, which have pretty good offerings, but they're also reliant on SMIC to manufacture their designs. So over the next year, I think we're going to see the emergence in China of better capabilities in advanced manufacturing. But it's hard to say how good this will be and how willing those developers in China will be to move away from the Nvidia ecosystem, which they've known for the last 10 years, 10 or so years. And it's hard to know when the Huawei alternative in particular will be good enough that developers will say, okay, we can switch over to this. Huawei's working overtime to make this easy. It's working with companies like DeepSeek and Alibaba to try to improve its offerings, but it's hard to say exactly when this happens. But in general, then I would think over time, Nvidia in this game, if the U.S. is going to continue to impose these controls on their GPUs, is probably looking at a pretty diminished market share in China if we look a little bit farther out, 2 to 3 years.
Paul, I only have 30 seconds, but I want to get this one in there. There are some, Paul, who do argue the U.S. government shouldn't be permitting Nvidia or AMD to sell AI chips to China because they say it's a national security risk. Quickly, Paul, 30 seconds. What's your response?
Well, look, I think that's a complicated question because I think that hinges on what you think AI will be used for in the future. The U.S. position is that it's going to be decisive in some military applications. I don't really accept that. I think the AI and China viewed AI as a very much a civilian technology, and most of the benefits are going to be in the civilian sector. Like any technology, of course, AI will be able to be used for military purposes. But really, it's not really even a dual-use technology. It's really a civilian use technology, and it's going to be so important that I think that focusing only on the potential national security risks of AI, I think, is going to be really detrimental, in particular to U.S.-China relations and to things like progress on AI safety. And then, of course, Taiwan is another potential political risk because, again, all these GPUs that we're talking about from Nvidia that we talked about today, nobody mentioned Taiwan, right? They're all manufactured in Taiwan, virtually all of them, right? Or packaged in Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, is a major geopolitical flashpoint here. So there's a lot of risks around treating AI as a race or a competition with China. And so I'm a little bit concerned that the risks could end up outweighing any gains that are perceived by controlling this technology, which is really a general use technology.
Paul, great to see you. Great to have you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.